हेलो फ्रेंड्स, केजी क्लासेस में आपका स्वागत है। आज हम आपको पीवी शैली के लॉन्ग आंसर के बारे में बताएंगे। क्वेश्चन है, राइट ए नोट ऑन ग्रीफ इन एडोनॉइस। आंसर, एडोनॉइस इज ए pastoral elegy and has an artificial form and structure. It is assumed that the artificiality of the form inhabits the genuine expression of grief. It is just a convention to write a pastoral elegy in imitation of the art of the ancient. In Milton's Lycidas, for example, more attention seems to have been paid to maintaining the form and convention than to expressing genuine gulf. The truth is that in following an established convention, not the very artificiality of a shepherd mourning the death of his companion, the mourning must be necessarily in a minor key. Now we shall have to consider whether what is true of Lycidas is also true of Adonais. Whether the grief for kids whom Sally could not have known very intimately is less acutely expressed than it should be. We have pointed out above that Shelley, as he goes on with the poem, breaks away from the pastoral tradition and more or less follows his own impulse and gives free expression to his personal feelings. Shelley admired Keats' Hyperion and saw in it the promise of a great poet left unfulfilled, as he thinks, by his untimely death. Further, Shelley was led to believe that Keats' death, though he was suffering from consumption, was hastened by the savage criticism of his indemnification in the Quarterly Review. He even went so far as to believe that his consumption was the effect of this unfair and malicious criticism. Shelley's heart went out to him. He looked upon Keats as one of the persecuted like himself, and Keats' fault, as it appeared to him, was that he did not write poetry on the traditional line, and so dared the unpastured dragon in his den. Shelley even offered to nurse him back to health if he would come and stay with him at Pisa, and wrote a letter of invitation to him, dates July 27, 1820. Nothing, however, came of it, and then when Shelley heard of Keats' death, he was deeply moved. Shelley wrote to John Gisborne, "I have perceived the heart rending according to the closing scene of the great genius whom envy and ingratitude scourged out of the world. I do not think that if I had seen it before, I could have composed my poem." There is thus clear evidence that Adonais was written out of genuine grief for Keats and admiration for the genius. Adonais breathes Shelley's passionate grief in every line. Art imposes a wise restraint on a poet, and Shelley never lets his grief break all bonds. He has in mind Bjorn's lament for Adonais in the beginning of the poem, and even adopts a variant of Adonais to so Keats is Adonais. The opening stanzas have an air of artificiality, but in the sixth stranger there is the genuine note of grief, but now thy youngest, dearest one has perished, the nursling of thy widowhood, who grew like a pale flower by some sad maiden cherished, and fed with true love tears instead of dew. It is Uranian Aphrodite who is invoked, and we see the difference here when he substitutes Uranian Aphrodite for him Beyond's Aphrodite Pandemos, and gives the grief to a spiritual plant. And it is Shelley's own grief, whatever the figure and imagery he may use according to the pastoral convention. The delicate references to Keats' poem Isabella or the Pot of Basil reveals to Shelley's genuine appreciation of Keats' poetry. The fact is that Shelley's grief, however circumscribed by the pastoral convention, is based upon his genuine admiration for Keats' genius, and the grief cannot but be sincere. Shelley sees his own fate in Keats. Why linger? Why turn back? Why shrink my heart? Thy hopes are gone before from all things here. They have departed, thou should now apart. These lines are not rhetoric but are impenetrated with his passionate feeling. These lines read as a prophecy of Shelley's death, which followed in less than a year after Keats. Shelley discovers identity in spirit between himself and Keats. It is not the death of a fellow poet that Shelley mourns, it is an identical spirit that rings the bell from his heart. All stood aloof, and at his partial moon smiled through their tears. Bell knew that gentle wind, who is another's fate, now wept his own. In these lines there is a note of keen, poignant grief. He feels all the more for Keats because he has been killed by the vindictive malice of his critics, and Shelley's righteous indignation burst forth against them. The haired wolves bold only to pursue the ocean's ravens, clamorous over the dead, the vultures to the conqueror's banner true, who fed where desolation first he has fed, and whose wings again contagion. This attack upon the critics is not out of the place here, for it is called forth by Shelley's grief. Pathos and grief blends in his lament. Most exquisite pathos is expressed in the lines, O gentle child, beautiful as thou wert, why didst thou leave the trodden path of man too soon, and with weak hands through mighty hearts dare the unpastured dragon in his den? Defenseless as thou wert, oh, where was then wisdom, the mirrored shield, or scorn the spear? After due mourning is paid, Shelley envisages the great destiny of Keats. Shelley respects and admires Keats' genius. His powers were not fully matured when he died, but Shelley perceived in him the promise of a great poet, that he is now merged in the universal mind. But what is but the common fate of the individual mind, as Shelley conceives it in terms of pantheism, Keats was a poet dedicated to beauty, so he said a thing of beauty is a joy forever. According to Shelley's idea of the principle of beauty working in the universe, beauty that shapes the things of nature, the one spreads plastic stress, compelling here there all new succession to the form they wear. Keats, after his death, becomes a part of it. The creative beauty in the world, the great destiny that Shelley conceived for Keats is that he is gathered to the kings of thought who begged contention with their time's decay and of the past are all that cannot pass away. Despite the artificiality of the form adopted, Shelley's grief rings throughout the poem. Shelley might have not known Keats intimately, but he readily discovered affinities of spirit between himself and Keats. He writes in the preface to the poem that was at first written and then concealed, I will allow myself a first and last word on the subject of calumny as it relates to me as an author. I have dared and invited censure. If I understood myself, I have written neither for profit nor for fame. I have employed my poetical composition and publication simply as the instrument of that sympathy between myself and others which the ardent and abounded love I cherished for my kind incited me to acquire. I expected all sorts of stupidity and insolent contempt from these. He imagines Keats to be in a plight similar to his own. He defeats his critic, but Keats was not able to do so. He writes with Keats in his mind, but a young spirit panting for fame, doubt of its power, and certain only of its aspirations, it is ill qualified to assign its true value of the sneer of this world, the more or less identity of position, the ground of sympathy, and lastly his genuine admiration for the genius of Keats gives the ring of sincerity to his grief. As Waterloo writes, Shelley was not intimate with Keats and had been slow to recognize his genius, but it was enough that he was a poet in sympathy with the radicals and exile and the victim of the Tory reviewer. Next question है, write a note on mysticism and or philosophy in Edelweiss or Platonism in Edelweiss. Answer: the last 17 stanza of Edelweiss express Shelley's mature philosophy. They deal with profound metaphysical questions put forth in stanza 21. Woe is me, whence are we, and why are we? Of what sense seen, the actors or spectators? The poem thus presents a transcendental consolation for mortal loss and tries to assess man's place in this universe. Man is a shadow, a phantom, yet this shadow is that of eternity. To use the words of Glutton Brook, we are taken into the unknown, moving from the ancient pastoral country to Shelley's own untrodden wilderness and airy height of thoughts. Shelley brooded over the origin and nature of human soul. Our purpose and status in this world, the nature and significance of death, the nature and origin of this universe, and the nature of the ultimate reality behind and beyond this universe. According to Shelley's proposition as propounded in Edelweiss, is a human soul is a portion of the universal soul subjected during its connection with the body to all the illusions, the dreams and nightmares of sense, and after the death of a body, it continues to be a portion of the universal soul liberated from those illusions and subsisting in some condition which the human reason is not capable of defining as a state either of personal consciousness or of absorption. According to Shelley, there is an all-pervading power in the universe. Call it the universal soul of the spirit of the universe. It is omnipresent. All things live and move and have their being in this universal power. This power animates the universe. Every portion of the universe is but the expression of this animating principle, as is also each individual mind, while subject to the limitations of mortality. Death, dissolving the ties of flesh, bring about the perfect union of the individual with the universal mind. All things live and move and have their being in this all-pervading spirit. It can be called light or beauty, that light whose smile kindles the universe, that beauty in which all things work and move. Shelley has given to this universal power various names such as light, beauty, one love, burning fountain, loveliness, thought, etc. The universal spirit is both immanent and transcendental. This power sustains the world from beneath and kindle it above. It is resplendent, emitting light and radiance. It is eternal and immutable, that sustaining love which through the web of being blindly wove by man and breast and earth and air and sea, once bright or dim, and that beauty in which all things work and move, or thoughts above, and its quick elements cannot die. In Adonais, Shelley presents a monistic conception. He presents the universal soul as the one which endures while the manifold appearances of the universal change. The one remains, the many change and pass. The one is a synthesis of all aesthetic, moral and metaphysical ideals like love, beauty, wisdom and power. The one includes intellectual beauty, intellectual love and intellectual freedom. Shelley's worshipful devotion to this great principle was strong. The functioning of this universal power is creation. It shapes and molds matter according to an ideal pattern. The one spirit plastic stress sweeps through the dull dense world, compelling their all new succession to the form they bear, torturing the unwilling draws that checks its flight to its own likeness, and each may bear. The substance of Shelley's philosophy can be seen in the lines where he compares life with a dome of many-colored glass which does not allow man to see eternity. It is only death that breaks this glass and enables man to see eternity. So death is a gateway for the soul's union with the Almighty. Human soul is the part of the universal soul. Shelley observes a portion of the eternal which must glow through time and change unquenchably the same. After death, the individual soul returns to the universal soul and merges in it, dust to the dust, but the pure spirit shall flow back to the burning fountain whence it came. Death frees the individual soul from the prison of modern and material life and leads to the identification of the individual soul with the universal soul. Death reunites the individual soul with the universal spirit from which the human soul has sprung. The view of human life as expressed in the poem is that of Maya and illusion. It is the painted van, it is the shadow of night, it is a mere dream, a sleep, sound and fury, signifying nothing, a walking shadow, the contagion of the world, slow, stand, fear and grief convulse us to vile worldly passions and consume us day by day. Death liberates human soul from bodily bondage and reunites it with the universal spirit. Matter is also imperishable, it changes but does not perish. Many of these concepts are Platonic, but Plato's view, though recurrent in Shelley, are not a fixed doctrine, but they occur as a living and varying inspirations. But according to Noto Paulus, stanza 52 beginnings with the one remains, the many change and pass is the epigrammatic expression of Platonism in English poetry. According to Desmond King held this stanza is not rigidly Platonic. In Plato's philosophy, material existence tarnishes the divine light, while according to this stanza, material existence enriches the divine light by imparting diverse colors of it. Critics like Rossetti, Weeks, S.A. Brooke and Desmond King find pantheistic thought in stanza 42 and 43 of the poem. He is made one with nature, there is heard his voice in all her music, from the moan of thunder to the song of night's sweet bird. He is a presence to be felt and known in darkness and in light, from herb and stone, spreading itself whereas that power may move which has withdrawn his being to its own, which wield the world with never varied love, sustain it from beneath and kindless in it above stanza 42. And he is a portion of the loveliness which once he made more lovely, he doth bear his part, while the one spirit's plastic stress sweeps through the dull, dense world, compelling their all new succession to the forms they wear, torturing the unwilling draws that checks its flight to its own likeness, as each mass may wear, and bursting in its beauty and its might, from trees and beast and man into the heavens light. Stanza 43. Nevertheless, Brailsford and George Santayana denied that Salish depart from pantheism in his philosophy. Santayana terms his philosophy panpsychism, the theory that all nature has a psychic side beyond its physical appearance. Some critics have found contradictions in Shelley's philosophy. In some stanza of Adonais, he says that after death the individual soul loses its identity and is merged in the universal soul. In other stanza, Keats is shown as retaining his separate identity after death as the vesper or evening star and shedding his light forever. But Charles Baker finds no philosophic contradiction in these two concepts. He explains that after death the individual soul of Keats becomes a part of the world soul, but at the same time he perpetuates his personal self on earth through his immortal poetry. A man can earn immortality on earth through his memorable achievement here. Thanks, best of luck.